Good evening to the night owls. Good afternoon to the day walkers. And good morning to the rising dead. Welcome to Classified Culture. If you enjoy science fiction and horror stories, then you've come to the right channel. Our goal is to provide quality and original stories for listeners on a regular basis. Every day there will be at least one or two new stories for your listening pleasure. Help this channel grow as a community. You can help by sharing this video, giving it a like, leaving a message in the comments section, and subscribing to the channel. Your feedback and support is always appreciated. Well, I suppose that's enough said for now. It's time for me to do what you all have been waiting for. It's time to let the words I speak guide your imagination with a dark and twisted tale. Dorian Whitlow's eyes snapped open as if they'd been pried apart by unseen hands. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped animal, echoing through the silence of his small apartment. He hadn't even realized he'd drifted off, not with Corinne's desperate words still ringing in his ears. "They're down there, Dorian. They want you." The room was bathed in the sickly glow of the street lamp outside his window, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist as if alive. His breath hitched in his throat, turning wet and uneven, a sound that grated against his nerves like nails on slate. He sat up, his body protesting the sudden movement with stiff joints and aching muscles. It was late, too late for Corinne to be out, especially in this state. Her pale face had been gaunt, cheeks hollowed by fear, or something worse, hair matted to her scalp like seaweed. She'd stumbled in, leaving a trail of water on his wooden floorboards, before collapsing onto his sofa with barely a whisper of explanation. His gaze drifted to the sofa now, empty but for the damp imprint of her body on the cushions. He rubbed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose as if that could dispel the image of her terrified face. When he opened them again, she was still there, etched into his mind's eye like a grotesque painting. A shiver ran down Dorian's spine, a chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. The room felt colder than it should have been, despite the warmth of the night outside. He could almost taste the salt in the air, as if the ocean itself was reaching out for him from its abyssal trench. He stood, pacing over to the window to close it, but paused when he saw the rain. It wasn't falling anymore. It seemed to be hanging there, suspended in midair like an unnatural fog. Dorian could have sworn he heard a wet dragging sound coming from somewhere outside, but when he listened closely, it was gone, replaced by nothing but the distant hum of nocturnal insects. Suddenly, Corinne's words echoed in his mind once more. "They're down there." He'd assumed she meant the depths of the ocean trench where they'd found that thing. The monolith, they called it now, though it bore no resemblance to any natural formation. But what if she hadn't been talking about the ocean at all? A sudden noise made him jump, a soft thud from somewhere within his apartment. He whipped around, eyes scanning the darkness, heart pounding in his chest like a drum. There it was again, a wet, dragging sound, this time unmistakably coming from inside. He reached out, flicking on the light switch with trembling fingers. The harsh fluorescent glare illuminated every corner of the room, casting long shadows that seemed to recoil from the sudden brightness. Dorian's breath caught in his throat as he saw what lay before him. Corinne was huddled against the far wall, her back pressed flat against the peeling wallpaper. Her eyes were wide, pupils dilated, until there was barely any blue left in her irises. She was breathing, if you could call it that. Each inhale was a ragged gasp, each exhale a wet gurgle that seemed to echo through the room like some grotesque symphony. And then he saw it. The line of blood tracing its way down from her mouth, dripping onto the floorboards below. It wasn't just one line either, but many, crisscrossing and intersecting until they formed a complex web of red against the pale wood. Dorian could almost hear the wet dragging sound again as he realized what had happened. Corinne hadn't stopped bleeding. She'd kept going long after she should have. A cold sweat broke out across Dorian's forehead as his mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. How was this possible? He'd seen her collapse onto his sofa mere hours ago, unconscious but alive. Now here she was, awake and breathing, yet clearly long past the point of survival. He moved closer, careful not to tread in the expanding pool of blood around her. As he neared, he noticed something else. Corinne's jaw seemed to be working at an impossible angle, moving side to side as if she were chewing on something invisible. There was no sound accompanying this motion, however, only that same wet, dragging noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. "Corinne?" Dorian whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. "What's happening?" Her eyes flicked towards him then, their gaze locked onto him with an unsettling intensity. He could see the whites of her eyes now too, bloodshot and glistening like wet marble. And in that moment, Dorian felt it, a cold tendril of dread coiling around his spine, winding its way up into his mind, until all he could think about was escape. But it was too late for that. He knew it as surely as he knew his own name. Whatever had happened to Corinne, whatever force had dragged her here and kept her alive far longer than she should have been, it wanted him now too, and there was nowhere left to run. As if reading his thoughts, Corinne's mouth opened wide, revealing a tongue slick with blood and something else. Something black and writhing that seemed to writhe towards him like a living shadow. Dorian stumbled back, horror rooting him to the spot as he realized what it was. Not a single creature but many, each one no larger than his little finger yet teeming with an unnatural life of their own. They were coming for him now, crawling out from Corinne's mouth and snaking down her body towards the floor. Towards him. Dorian turned to run, but his legs felt heavy, sluggish as if mired in mud. He could hear them behind him, that wet dragging sound growing louder with each passing second until it filled his ears completely. And then they were on him, swarming over his skin like 1,000 tiny claws, biting and tearing at his flesh. Dorian screamed, falling to the ground as pain exploded across every inch of his body. He could feel them inside him now too, burrowing beneath his skin, wriggling through his veins like parasites. He tried to fight them off, scratching at his arms and face until they were a mass of blood and torn flesh. But it was no use. For every one he managed to dislodge, 10 more took its place. They filled his mouth too, choking him until he could barely breathe, let alone scream. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The creatures retreated, slinking back into Corinne's body until she was once again a lifeless shell of herself. Dorian lay there panting, his body racked with pain and exhaustion. He felt violated, contaminated on some deep, primal level that went beyond mere physical injury. He looked up at last, meeting Corinne's glassy stare, and in that moment, he understood. This was what she'd been trying to warn him about. They were down there all right. Dorian woke to the sensation of something wet brushing against his cheek. His eyes flew open, heart pounding in his chest like a drummer's funeral march. The room was bathed in an eerie blue-green light that seemed to leach all color from the world, leaving only shades of gray and sickly aquamarine. It took him a moment to realize it was coming from the ocean outside, the waves crashing against the cliffs below his apartment with a relentless ferocity. He turned his head slowly, his stiff neck popping audibly in the silence. There she was again, Corinne, huddled against the wall like a forgotten doll. Her eyes were open wide, staring at nothing with an intensity that made Dorian's skin crawl. He reached out tentatively, his fingers hovering just above her eyelids before gently closing them. She looked almost peaceful now, save for the dark bruises around her mouth and the way her jaw seemed to twitch spasmodically, even in death. As he sat back on his heels, Dorian noticed something else. Corinne's skin was damp, glistening like she'd been caught out in the rain. But it wasn't water, it was silt, fine grains of it clinging to every inch of exposed flesh, filling the lines of her fingers and the hollows of her eyes. He recoiled, horror welling up within him as he realized what this meant. Whatever had happened to Corinne hadn't happened quickly or cleanly. She'd been alive down there, trapped beneath the crushing pressure of the deep ocean trench, for far longer than any human should have survived. A chill ran down Dorian's spine, colder even than the unnatural temperature that seemed to permeate his apartment now. He could almost hear Corinne's voice echoing through his mind, whispering her desperate warning. They're down there. But who were they? And what did they want with him? He searched the room, looking for any clue that might explain what had happened to Corinne. His gaze fell upon an old letter tucked away in a corner, half hidden beneath a stack of books. It was creased and yellowed with age, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Julian's neat script spilled across the page like ink stains on parchment. Dorian picked up the letter carefully, as if it might crumble to dust at his touch. He unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the lines until they caught on a single sentence. A monolith. Dorian. Huge beyond belief, and alien beyond comprehension. It's like nothing we've ever seen before. Julian had been one of the first explorers to dive into the trench, back when they were still trying to understand its vastness rather than fear it. He'd sent this letter just days before disappearing without a trace, along with his entire crew. Everyone had assumed they'd died in an accident, their bodies lost forever to the abyssal depths. But now Dorian wasn't so sure. What if something else had happened down there? Something otherworldly? He read on, his heart pounding harder with each passing line. We found something inside it, Dorian. Something alive. It's unlike anything I've ever seen. Tentacles, teeth, eyes everywhere. But it's intelligent too, I swear it is. It communicates through patterns of pressure waves, like a language we can barely begin to comprehend. Dorian dropped the letter as if burned, his stomach roiling at the thought of whatever creature Julian had encountered. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run, to flee this place, and never look back. But it was too late for that. He knew it just as surely as he knew his own name. Because Corinne hadn't been the first warning sign, she'd merely been the loudest. There were others now, signs of something ancient and malevolent stirring beneath the ocean's surface. Signs like the wet dragging sound he'd heard outside last night, growing louder until it seemed to fill the very walls of his apartment. And the sounds weren't the only evidence. There was the chill too, that unnatural cold that seemed to seep into his bones, no matter how high he turned up the thermostat. And then there were the whispers, soft at first, barely perceptible beneath the crash of waves against the cliffs below. But growing louder now, insistent, like 1,000 voices whispering all at once. He pressed his hands against his ears, trying to block out their sibilant murmurings, but it was no use. They were inside his mind too, wriggling through his thoughts like worms, until he couldn't tell where his own voice ended and theirs began. Dorian stumbled back, colliding with something solid behind him. He turned around slowly, his breath catching in his throat as he took in the sight before him. The kitchen chair had been dragged backwards into the corner, its legs splayed out like broken limbs. And on the wall above it, scrawled in blood that still glistened wetly even now, were more words. You can't escape us. Dorian felt a cold tendril of dread coil around his spine, winding its way up into his mind, until all he could think about was escape. But there was nowhere left to run. They'd found him here, in his own home, and now they were closing in. He could hear them clearly now, those wet dragging sounds echoing through every room of the apartment like a chorus from hell. They moved with purpose too, their progress marked by the splintering crash of furniture being overturned, the tinkle of glass shattering against the floorboards. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything went still. The dragging sound stopped, the whispers faded away to nothing. Dorian stood there panting, his heart hammering wildly in his chest as he waited for whatever came next. It happened suddenly, without warning. One moment, the room was empty, save for the wreckage of furniture and shattered crockery. The next, Corinne was there again, standing right behind him with her arms outstretched like a grotesque marionette. But this time, she wasn't alone. Something else hung from her hands, something long and black and glistening wetly in the eerie light. Dorian turned slowly, his breath catching in his throat as he realized what it was. Not a creature, but many, each one no larger than his little finger, yet teeming with an unnatural life of their own. They writhed and squirmed like maggots on rotting flesh, their bodies segmented into countless tiny joints that allowed them to bend at impossible angles. And then they began to move, slithering down Corinne's arms towards the floor, towards him. Dorian stumbled back, horror rooting him to the spot as he realized what was happening. They were coming for him now, just as Corinne had warned. He turned to run, but it was too late. The creatures were already on him, swarming over his skin like 1,000 tiny claws. He could hear them clearly now, that wet chewing sound filling his ears completely, drowning out even the crash of waves against the cliffs below. They tore at his flesh with relentless hunger. Dorian's scream echoed through his apartment like a physical thing, bouncing off walls already slick with condensation. He fell backwards, clutching at his face, trying to prise the wriggling creatures from his skin. But they were everywhere now, under his clothes, inside his hair, their tiny legs scraping against his teeth as they tried to force themselves into his mouth. He stumbled towards the door, desperation lending him strength, despite the agony coursing through every vein. He needed to get out, to escape this hellish assault before it was too late. But even as he reached for the handle, he knew there would be no sanctuary waiting for him beyond that threshold. They'd found him here. They'd followed him home. His hand slipped on the wet metal knob, fingers leaving streaks of blood and silt behind. He could hear them still, their ceaseless chewing filling his ears with a sickening symphony. It seemed impossible that such tiny creatures could cause so much damage, but then again, nothing about this was natural. With a final desperate heave, Dorian wrenched the door open and fell out into the corridor beyond. The air here was cool, damp, and heavy with the scent of salt water and decay. He tried to take a deep breath, but his lungs felt heavy, filled with something other than air. Wetness bubbled at the corners of his mouth as he coughed violently, spewing forth a torrent of silt and glistening, writhing creatures. He crawled away from them, leaving a trail of shattered crockery and splintered furniture in his wake. His hands slipped on the wet floorboards, fingers sinking into rotting timber that crumbled beneath his touch like damp sandcastle. The walls seemed to close in around him, their once white surfaces now stained black with algae and mold. Somewhere behind him, he heard a wet dragging sound, followed by the splintering crash of wood giving way under some unseen force. They were still coming for him even out here in the hallway. There was nowhere left to run. No sanctuary would be found within these walls. He needed help, proper help if he had any hope of escaping this living nightmare. His mind flashed back to Julian's letter, tucked safely away inside his jacket pocket alongside Corinne's warning note. The words swam before his eyes as he tried to focus on them amidst the pain and terror. The signals coming from deep beneath Challenger, deep trance. We found something down there, Dorian. An artifact of some kind. An idea began to form amidst the chaos, fueled by desperation and fear. If this thing, this creature, whatever it was, had come from the depths of the ocean, perhaps that was where he could find answers too. He stumbled towards the stairs, each step a battle against the agony racking his body. His breathing came in ragged gasps now, wet and uneven as if something was blocking his airways completely. He could feel them still, writhing beneath his skin, burrowing deeper into flesh and bone with every labored breath. The journey down seemed endless, each step echoing through the building like a death knell. By the time he reached the front door, Dorian was barely more than a staggering wreck of flesh and blood, his body racked with pain and exhaustion. He fell out onto the street, landing heavily on damp cobblestones, slick with rainwater. Above him loomed the monolith, its black surface glistening under the cold light of the moon like an obsidian mirror, reflecting back all the darkness within him. It seemed to call out to him then, whispering promises of answers hidden deep beneath its alien surface. And despite everything, despite the horror and the pain and the sheer, utter madness of it all, Dorian found himself drawn towards that voice, compelled by some unseen force to follow where it led. He stumbled along the water's edge, the cold spray stinging against his lacerated skin like acid. The wet dragging sounds echoed in his mind now, drowning out even the crash of waves against the cliffs below. They were with him still, always watching, always waiting. Ahead, he saw a figure standing alone on the edge of the docks. Even from this distance, Dorian could sense something off about them, some subtle wrongness that set his nerves alight with fresh terror. But there was no turning back now. He needed help, and this person might be his only chance. As he drew closer, Dorian realized it was a woman, her form silhouetted against the churning sea behind her. She seemed to sense his approach too, turning slowly to face him as if she'd been expecting his arrival all along. Her eyes caught the moonlight, reflecting back at him like twin orbs of silver fire. "Victor," Dorian rasped, recognizing the name from Julian's letter despite the pain distorting his words. "You're here because of the signal too?" The woman nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his face. Up close, Dorian could see that there was something else about her eyes besides their uncanny luminescence. They seemed somehow wrong, too large for her face perhaps. Or maybe it was just the way they seemed to stare right through him, as if seeing something entirely different from what was actually there. "You're with the research team?" Dorian asked hesitantly, each word a battle against the agony racking his body. He could feel them still, writhing beneath his skin, their tiny legs scraping against his bones, like needles driven deep into flesh. Victor, if indeed that was her name, regarded him silently for a moment before speaking. Her voice held an odd cadence, rhythmic and almost musical in its flow, yet utterly devoid of any warmth or emotion. "We are studying the phenomenon together," she said finally. "You have seen it too?" Dorian nodded, gesturing towards his ruined body. "I've seen things," he managed to say before another bout of coughing seized him, spewing forth a fresh torrent of silt and glistening creatures onto the damp dockboards. Victor watched this display with something approaching clinical detachment, her eyes never leaving Dorian's face, despite the horror unfolding before her. When finally he regained control over his breathing, she spoke again. "You will join us then," she said flatly. "There is much you must learn." And so, without further ceremony, Dorian Whitlow found himself welcomed into the fold of a research team dedicated to unraveling the mysteries surrounding an alien monolith, submerged deep beneath the ocean's surface. Little did he know that acceptance would merely mark the beginning of his descent into madness, a journey from which there could be no escape, no redemption. For in joining this team, Dorian had taken his first step down a path leading directly towards the heart of darkness itself, where ancient horrors lurked unseen amidst the crushing depths of Challenger Deep Trench. And though he would come to realize too late the true nature of those who sought his company, it was already far too late for salvation. As they turned away from the water's edge together, Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that something watched them go, some unseen presence lurking just beyond the light's reach, its hunger sharpened by their every step towards that. Dorian followed Victor through the labyrinthine corridors of the research vessel, each step echoing ominously in the cramped space. The air was thick with the scent of salt water and something else, a tang like metal left too long out in the rain. His body ached with a dull, throbbing pain that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat, but he pushed on, driven by curiosity and desperation. They reached a door marked with symbols Dorian didn't recognize. Victor pressed her palm against a scanner, and the door slid open with a hiss of compressed air. Inside, several figures were hunched over workstations, their bodies silhouetted against the glow of holographic displays. They turned as one to regard Dorian, their eyes gleaming with an eerie familiarity. "Welcome," said a voice from the shadows. A figure emerged into the light, revealing itself as Celine, her eyes glowing softly like lanterns in the dim room. She approached Dorian, her gaze never leaving his face. "We've been expecting you." Dorian shuddered involuntarily, the feeling of being watched intensifying tenfold. He felt exposed under their collective scrutiny, each gaze like a physical weight pressing down upon him. "How did you know I was coming?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Celine smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "We have our ways," she said cryptically, before turning back to her workstation. Dorian noticed then that the others had returned to their tasks as well, their fingers dancing over holographic controls with an unsettling fluidity. Victor guided him towards a chair positioned before a bank of monitors displaying live feeds from underwater cameras. As he sat down, Dorian felt something shift beneath his skin, writhing like worms in a grave. He stifled a moan and clenched his teeth against the pain, but not before catching sight of Victor's satisfied smirk. On the screens before him, Dorian beheld the alien monolith for the first time since his descent into madness. It loomed out of the abyss, like a leviathan rising from the depths of hell itself, its surface glistening with an otherworldly luminescence that seemed to pulse in time with some unheard heartbeat. As he watched, Dorian felt a strange sensation wash over him, a sense of familiarity mixed with dread. He had seen this thing before, dreamed it perhaps, though the memory eluded him like smoke through fingers. Yet there was something else too, something almost welcoming about its presence. It was as if some part of him recognized this monolith, welcomed it even. "It's beautiful," he murmured, his breath fogging up the glass. "Isn't it?" agreed Celine softly from behind him. "We've studied it for months now, and still we know so little about its true nature." Dorian felt a chill run down his spine at her words. There was something wrong with that voice, something off-kilter about its cadence. It was almost too perfect, too rhythmic, as if spoken by someone, or something, not quite human. "Tell me," Dorian said, turning to face her, "what do you know about this thing? Where did it come from?" Celine shrugged elegantly. "No one knows for certain," she admitted. "Some believe it was seeded here millennia ago by ancient astronauts. Others think it may be a remnant of some long-forgotten civilization swallowed up by the ocean. Or perhaps," interjected Victor darkly, "it was always here, waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal itself." Dorian's gaze drifted back to the monitors, drawn inexorably towards the alien monolith. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not just by each other but by something far older and more malevolent lurking beneath the crushing depths of Challenger Deep Trench. As if reading his thoughts, Leon approached him from behind, placing a hand on Dorian's shoulder. "It knows you're here," he whispered, his breath hot against Dorian's ear. "It sees you watching it." Dorian shivered violently at the contact, but before he could respond, Julian entered the room carrying something wrapped in cloth. The atmosphere changed instantly. Tension filled the air like static before a storm. "Bring him to the observation chamber," Julian ordered abruptly, his eyes never leaving Dorian's face. Without waiting for a response, Julian turned and left the room. Dorian hesitated only briefly before following, curiosity overcoming fear once more. He felt compelled towards this mystery, drawn by forces unseen yet irresistible. They entered another doorway, this one leading to a large chamber filled with equipment Dorian couldn't begin to understand. At its center stood a glass tank filled with murky water, suspended from the ceiling by heavy chains. Inside it floated something wrong. Dorian approached cautiously, his breath catching in his throat as he got his first clear look at what hung there like some bloated, ruined carcass. It was humanoid in shape but grossly distorted, its flesh stretched taut over bulging muscles and twisted bones. Its eyes were gone, replaced by glistening orbs that seemed to pulse with an inner light. But it was the jaw that held Dorian captive, working at an impossible angle as if chewing on some invisible morsel. It moved slowly at first, then gained speed until it was a blur of motion, clicking and clacking like teeth made from stone grinding against one another. "Mate subject beta," said Julian coldly. "It was once a man like you, Dorian." Dorian tore his gaze away from the horrifying sight to look at Julian, horror etched deep into every line of his face. What happened to him?" he managed to ask through clenched teeth. Julian shrugged nonchalantly. "We don't know precisely," he admitted, "but we believe it has something to do with prolonged exposure to the monolith's influence." Dorian turned back towards the tank, unable to tear his eyes away from the nightmare within. He noticed then that around the edges of the creature's mouth were tiny marks, like bite wounds, or perhaps entry points for some unseen invaders. His stomach churned as realization dawned upon him. This was what awaited those who lingered too long beneath Challenger Deep Trench. This was the fate of those who dared to stare too closely into the abyss and found themselves stared back at by something ancient, something hungry. "Is it alive?" Dorian asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," replied Victor flatly. "Not exactly." Dorian felt bile rise in his throat as he watched the jaw continue its relentless chewing motion, even now, long after any semblance of life should have abandoned this tortured husk. He knew then that they had been wrong to come here, that their quest for knowledge had led them down a path from which there could be no return. For as Dorian stared into the depths of that tank, he felt something else staring back at him, its gaze like cold fingers tracing along his spine, and in that moment he knew with absolute certainty it was watching them all, always watching, always waiting. As if on cue, a wet, dragging sound echoed through the chamber, growing. Dorian's breath echoed in his ears as he backed away from Subject Beta's tank, his heart pounding like a drum against his ribs. He tried to tear his gaze away, but found himself ensnared by those pulsing orbs, feeling an inexplicable connection to the ruined figure within. Julian stepped closer to him, breaking the spell. "You're trembling," he observed clinically. "Are you all right?" Dorian took a deep breath, trying to regain composure. His lungs felt heavy, each inhalation laborious and wet. He ignored Julian's concern, turning instead towards Victor, who was now fidgeting with some equipment on one of the many consoles scattered around the room. "Victor," Dorian called out, his voice raspier than intended. "Can we get a closer look at the monolith?" Victor glanced up at him, his eyes reflecting the cold glow of the monitor screens. "Certainly," he replied, turning back to his task, "but you must be prepared for what awaits." Dorian nodded, steeling himself as Victor manipulated the controls. The room's main holographic display flickered to life, revealing a clearer image of the monolith submerged beneath Challenger Deep Trench. It loomed large and menacing, its surface slick with bioluminescent algae that cast eerie shadows on its obsidian form. As they stared at the monolith, Dorian began to hear whispers. At first, he thought it was his imagination playing tricks on him, but as the volume grew louder, he realized they were coming from the display itself. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning the hologram for any sign of distortion or malfunction. "Can you hear that?" he asked the others, dread coiling around his spine like a serpent. Julian and Celine approached, their faces etched with confusion as they listened intently. "Hear what?" Julian asked, his brow furrowed. Dorian's heart sank. He was alone in this auditory hallucination, hearing voices that spoke in languages he shouldn't understand, yet somehow did. They whispered words from tongues long forgotten by humanity, speaking of ancient horrors and cosmic truths beyond human comprehension. And amidst the babble, Dorian thought he heard something else, his own voice, echoing distortedly as if spoken through waterlogged lungs. He strained to listen, feeling a cold sweat beading on his forehead. "Dorian, Dorian." It seemed to call him, beckoning him deeper into madness. He shook his head violently, trying to dislodge the unsettling whispers from his mind, but they persisted, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. Dorian felt panic rise within him like bile in his throat, threatening to spill over at any second. "Make it stop," he cried out suddenly, his voice raw with desperation. Victor turned towards him. Surprise itched across his face. "Stop what?" he asked warily. "The voices," Dorian gasped, pressing his hands against his ears as if that could somehow silence the cacophony within. "They won't stop." Julian took a step closer to Dorian, concern now replaced by curiosity. He reached out tentatively towards Dorian's forehead, but Dorian flinched away from his touch. "Don't," he warned hoarsely. "It's not safe." Julian hesitated before speaking again. "Dorian, we don't hear any voices. Are you sure you're all right?" Before Dorian could respond, darkness claimed him. He stumbled backwards, his vision blurring as consciousness slipped away like sand through fingers. The last thing he saw was Julian's horrified expression before everything went black. When Dorian came to, he found himself slumped against one of the consoles, his limbs heavy and unresponsive. He blinked groggily, trying to regain control over his traitorous body. A dull ache throbbed at the back of his head where it had made contact with something hard during his fall. Voices reached him from afar. Julian's voice, laced with concern. Celine's softer tones trying to calm him down. But there was another voice too, one that sent shivers crawling up Dorian's spine despite its quiet reassurance. The unseen watcher. It spoke in hushed whispers directly into Dorian's mind, soothing away his panic even as it stoked the embers of dread within him. "You're safe now," it whispered. "Rest, Dorian. You'll need your strength." He struggled against the compulsion to comply, but his body refused to obey his commands. His eyelids grew heavy once more, slipping closed despite his protests until darkness claimed him again. This time when Dorian woke up, he felt different. His thoughts seemed clearer, more focused than before. Yet there was something else too, a subtle shift in his perception of the world around him. Everything appeared slightly off-kilter, as if reality had been ever so slightly warped out of shape by some unseen force. He pushed himself upright, ignoring the protests from his abused muscles. Julian and Celine were still there, their faces etched with worry as they watched over him like nurses attending to an invalid patient. "Where am I?" Dorian asked, his voice echoing strangely in his ears. "What happened?" Julian exhaled loudly, relief evident on his face. "You fainted," he explained. "We think it might have something to do with all the stress you've been under lately." Dorian nodded absently, his gaze drawn towards one of the nearby monitors displaying footage from inside the monolith. As he watched, he noticed something peculiar about the creature's movements. They seemed almost rhythmic. With each beat of its grotesque jaw, the floor beneath Dorian's feet vibrated slightly, sending waves of nausea coursing through him. He counted each pulse, feeling his heartbeat sync with that of the monstrosity before him until it felt as though they were one and the same. "Dorian?" Celine called out softly, her voice barely audible over the pounding in his ears. "Are you all right?" He turned to face her, seeing not concern but amusement playing at the corners of her mouth. She knew what was happening to him. She understood these horrors better than anyone else present, and yet she chose to keep silent. A chill ran down Dorian's spine as realization dawned upon him. Celine was part of this. They all were. Each one of them had been touched by the unseen watcher, their minds twisted and warped until they served its purpose willingly. "You're not here to help me," Dorian accused, his voice barely above a whisper. "None of you are." Celine's smile faded, replaced by an expression of cold indifference. She turned away from him without another word, leaving Dorian alone with his thoughts once more. As he sat there, surrounded by the silent witnesses to his torment, Dorian felt something wet and sticky beneath his fingers. He looked down to find them coated in blood, his own, judging by the metallic scent that filled his nostrils. His breath caught in his throat as panic threatened to consume him once again, but he forced himself to remain calm. What had happened? He wondered desperately, scanning his memory for any sign of injury or violence. But there was nothing, no indication whatsoever of how he might have come to. Dorian's gaze flicked back to the monitor displaying the creature's interior. The rhythmic pulsing of its jaw had slowed, as if sensing his scrutiny. But now something else caught his eye, a subtle shift in the creature's form that made him lean closer to the screen. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. It was still there, a faint glow emanating from within the creature's core, pulsating like a heartbeat. As he watched, it grew brighter, casting eerie shadows on the cavernous walls of the monolith. Dorian felt an inexplicable urge to reach out, to touch that light as if it were tangible. "Celine," he whispered, barely audible over the pounding in his ears. "Do you see this?" She glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable before returning her attention to her workstation. Dorian's heart sank. She wasn't going to help him, not unless it served whatever purpose drove them all now. The wet dragging sound echoed through the room again, louder this time. It seemed closer too, resonating within the walls themselves. Dorian shivered, his mind conjuring images of unseen horrors moving just beyond reach. He tried to dismiss them as mere figments of his imagination, but found it difficult given the context. Julian approached him suddenly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Dorian flinched away involuntarily, glaring at Julian with barely concealed hostility. The man simply smiled, unfazed by Dorian's reaction. "Dorian," he said softly, "you're safe here. You know that." Dorian scoffed inwardly, but chose not to respond aloud. Instead, he stood up abruptly and walked away from both Julian and the monitor displaying the creature. As he moved deeper into the facility, he realized just how much it had changed since his arrival. The once pristine corridors were now marred by cracks and fissures that seemed to grow wider with each passing moment. The hum of machinery echoed through them at odd intervals, like distant heartbeats struggling to maintain their rhythm. And the air, it tasted wrong somehow, metallic and charged with an underlying current of dread. He paused outside a door marked Laboratory 3. It hung slightly askew on its hinges, revealing glimpses of what lay within. Shattered glass, upturned furniture, and something else. Something that made his stomach churn. Dorian reached out hesitantly, pushing the door open further until he could step inside. The room was a mess, not unlike his own mind felt most days lately, but it was the centerpiece that drew his attention, compelling him forward, despite every instinct screaming at him to run. There, suspended from the ceiling by what appeared to be lengths of intestinal tubing, hung Leon. His friend's body had been altered. His limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, reminiscent of a marionette left too long in the hands of a cruel puppeteer. But it was his hands that made Dorian gasp aloud. They were permanently curled into claws, as if frozen mid-scream. "Leon?" Dorian whispered, approaching cautiously. He reached out tentatively, brushing one clawed hand gently with his fingertips. It felt cold and hard, like stone rather than flesh. A faint glow emanated from within Leon's closed eyes, casting eerie shadows on his contorted features. Dorian leaned closer, trying to discern if it was simply a trick of the light or something more sinister. As he did so, Leon's head snapped up suddenly, causing Dorian to stumble backwards with a cry of surprise. Those glowing eyes met his gaze unblinkingly, filled with an ancient intelligence that sent shivers down Dorian's spine. He knew then without question. Leon was awake, aware, and terrified. "Leon," Dorian choked out, tears welling up in his own eyes. "What did they do to you?" As if in response, the glowing orbs within Leon's sockets pulsed brighter briefly before dimming once more. Dorian reached for him again, but hesitated when he noticed something else, a faint clicking sound emanating from behind those closed jaws. It was rhythmic, almost hypnotic, and completely impossible given Leon's current state. Dorian's breath caught in his throat as realization dawned upon him. That sound wasn't coming from Leon at all. It was coming from whatever lay hidden inside him. Revulsion welled up within Dorian, threatening to overwhelm him entirely. He stumbled away from Leon's mutilated form, barely managing to keep himself upright until he reached the safety of the corridor once more. Leaning against the wall for support, he slid down into a heap on the floor, burying his face in his hands. How long had they been like this? How many others had suffered such indignities at the unseen watcher's command? And why hadn't anyone tried to stop it? Why wasn't I able to stop it? Dorian thought bitterly. I knew something was wrong from the beginning. His mind raced back over his memories, searching for any sign that he'd missed, some clue revealing when things had begun to unravel. But there was nothing. No single moment stood out above another as a turning point. Instead, it seemed as though they had all been slowly overtaken by madness, their minds gradually warped until they served the unseen watcher's purpose willingly. And now Dorian feared that he too might be succumbing to its influence. The realization filled him with horror, rooting him to the spot despite his desperate urge to flee. If he couldn't trust himself anymore, then who could he trust? A sudden noise startled him, a wet sucking sound echoing through the walls once more. It was louder this time, closer still, and accompanied by something else, a faint scraping that made Dorian's skin crawl. He forced himself upright, listening intently as the sounds moved along the corridors beyond his line of sight. They seemed to be getting closer, growing louder with each passing moment until finally they stopped directly outside Laboratory 3's door. Dorian held his breath, heart pounding wildly in his chest. He knew what was coming next. He'd heard it enough times before now. And yet, when the door groaned open slowly, revealing nothing but empty hallway beyond, Dorian felt a rush of relief wash over him nonetheless. Until he noticed something else. Celine's bioluminescent glow seemed to have intensified since last he saw her, casting long shadows that danced macabrely across the walls. And when she turned to face him, her skin seemed to ripple and shift beneath its ethereal light, revealing glimpses of something dark and sinister lurking just beneath the surface. "Celine?" Dorian whispered, fear etched into every syllable. What are you becoming?" She took a step towards him, her eyes never leaving his gaze. As she did so, that wet dragging sound echoed once more through the facility, louder than ever before. It seemed to reverberate within Celine herself now, her body pulsating in time with its rhythm. "You shouldn't have come here," she rasped, her voice barely recognizable as human. "None of you should have." Dorian backed away instinctively, horror coursing through him like liquid ice. But there was. Dorian stood rooted to the spot, staring at Celine in disbelief. Her form seemed to undulate beneath her skin, writhing like a nest of serpents beneath the surface. The once familiar glow now cast grotesque shadows that danced across her face, contorting her features into something almost unrecognizable. Her breath came in wet, ragged gasps, each one sounding more laborious than the last. It was as if she were trying to inhale the very air around her, drawing it deep into her lungs only for it to fight against being consumed. Dorian could see the effort it took now, every inhalation marked by a sickening gurgle that made his stomach churn. He wanted to look away but found himself unable to do so. It was like watching a car wreck in slow motion, horrific yet utterly captivating all at once. Celine seemed almost hypnotized herself, her eyes locked onto Dorian's with an intensity he'd never witnessed before. "You shouldn't have come here," she repeated, her voice little more than a rasping whisper now. It sounded like rocks grinding against each other underwater, harsh and painful to hear. "None of you should have." Dorian felt a chill run down his spine at the words. They echoed something he'd heard before, a phrase that had haunted him ever since they first arrived here. But where once it had been spoken by an unseen presence, now it came from someone he knew. Someone who was supposed to be on their side. "What do you mean?" he asked, despite knowing deep down that he didn't want to hear the answer. Celine took another step towards him, her movements jerky and unnatural. Her skin seemed to ripple again as she did so, a sickening sensation that made Dorian's flesh crawl. He could feel bile rising in his throat but swallowed it back down forcefully, refusing to let himself succumb to fear just yet. "You'll see," Celine whispered, her eyes never leaving his own. "You'll all see soon enough." Before Dorian could respond, a sudden noise echoed through the facility once more, that same wet dragging sound that had haunted him since arriving here. This time, however, it seemed louder still, more insistent somehow. It moved along the corridors outside Laboratory 3 with purpose, growing closer with each passing moment until finally, It stopped directly behind Celine. Dorian's heart pounded wildly in his chest as he waited for whatever was coming next. He knew what he would find if he turned around. Knew that whatever was making that sound had been responsible for Leon's transformation too. But still, he couldn't bring himself to look away from Celine's gaze, trapped there like a fly caught in a spider's web. Then, without warning, something began to push its way out through Celine's back. It started as little more than a bulge beneath her skin, slowly growing larger until it began to stretch and distort her form completely. Dorian watched in horror as veins of pulsating light seemed to spread across her body like roots reaching outwards, branching and intertwining until they covered every inch of her flesh. He saw now why she had seemed so much taller when he first encountered her earlier, why her skin had appeared stretched taut over her bones. It wasn't simply that she was becoming something else entirely, but rather that something else was forcing its way out through her body, growing larger and stronger even as Dorian watched helplessly. The wet dragging sound grew louder still now, filling the room with its awful rhythm until it felt like the very air itself was pulsating along with it. Dorian could feel it resonating within his own chest too, his heartbeat synchronizing with that terrible noise despite himself. And then, without any further warning, Celine's body seemed to explode outwards in a shower of luminescent fluid and shattered bone. The force of the impact sent Dorian sprawling backwards across the floor, his ears ringing from the sudden shockwave. He landed heavily against one of the laboratory tables behind him, sending instruments scattering across its surface with a clatter. Pain shot through his left shoulder, where he'd hit it hard enough to leave him winded momentarily, but Dorian didn't have time to dwell on such minor injuries right now. Instead, he scrambled back up onto his feet and turned just in time to see what had emerged from Celine's ruined form. At first glance, it appeared almost human-like, standing upright on two legs at least, with arms and a head attached too. But any similarity ended there. This thing was easily 10 feet tall, if not more, its body composed entirely of pulsating light that seemed to shift and change constantly, like waves crashing against some unseen shore. Its limbs were long and thin, almost skeletal in appearance, while its head bore little resemblance to anything remotely human. Instead, it possessed a series of grotesque appendages that hung down from where its face should have been, each one writhing independently as if alive with their own malevolent intelligence. And then there were the eyes. Oh God, the eyes. There seemed to be no end to them, glowing orbs of pure light that covered every inch of the creature's body, save for those areas where dark shadows remained unmoving beneath its surface. They regarded Dorian now with an ancient alien intelligence that made his blood run cold. He knew instantly what this was, could feel it resonating deep within his very soul, even as he struggled to comprehend such a monstrous form in reality. This was the unseen watcher they had felt since arriving here, the malevolent force behind everything that had happened aboard the Zephyr thus far. And now, finally, it had revealed itself. Dorian stumbled backwards instinctively, fear coursing through him like liquid ice. He knew he should run, flee this place while he still could, but found himself unable to move so much as a single step away from where he stood. It was as if the creature held him rooted in place by sheer force of will alone. "Who? What are you?" Dorian managed finally, his voice barely more than a whisper, despite the desperate terror coursing through every fiber of his being. The creature seemed to regard him silently for several long moments before speaking at last. Its voice echoed through the laboratory like thunder, deep and resonating with an ancient power that made Dorian's very bones ache just hearing it. "You know who I am?" it said, its words accompanied by a sudden surge of pulsating light from within its form. "I've been watching you all for so long now." Dorian shook his head despite himself, denial rising up inside him like bile at the back of his throat. No, that can't be right. We only just arrived here." "And yet," the creature continued, ignoring Dorian's protests entirely, "you came willingly, nonetheless. Drawn by promises of wealth and glory, yes, or perhaps simply a desire to play God amongst the stars." It took another step towards him now, its movements graceful despite their horrifying appearance. Dorian could feel the air growing colder around them too. Could see condensation beginning to form on the surfaces of nearby equipment, as moisture seemed to be drawn out of the very air itself. "That is how we found you," it said softly, almost regretfully. "So many lost souls wandering through life without." In the oppressive darkness of Laboratory 3, Dorian's eyes fluttered open to an unwelcome sight. He was no longer on the cold steel floor where Celine had been consumed, but strapped upright to an operating table, his arms and legs restrained by heavy leather straps. Panic surged through him like a wild animal, but it was swiftly tempered by the realization that he couldn't move so much as a finger. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound echoing loudly in the silence. A sudden wet, dragging sound echoed from the walls, setting Dorian's nerves on edge. It was the same noise he'd heard before, but now it seemed louder, more insistent, as if whatever made it was moving closer. He strained his eyes to pierce the darkness, but the only light came from a faint emergency glow that cast long, menacing shadows across the lab. The dragging sound stopped abruptly, and then there was another noise, a high-pitched whine like metal grinding against metal. Dorian felt something cold touch his chest, followed by an icy burn that made him gasp in pain. He looked down as far as his neck would allow, just as a scalpel sliced through his shirt and into his flesh. Panic clawed at his throat, but he bit back the scream that threatened to escape. Instead, he focused on the sensation of cold steel against his skin, forcing himself to remain still despite the urge to struggle against his bonds. The unseen force wielding the scalpel seemed precise, methodical. It was as if it knew exactly what it was doing. The blade continued its path downwards, cutting through fabric and flesh with equal indifference. Dorian gritted his teeth against the pain, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The room filled with the scent of blood and metal, a sickening combination that turned his stomach. As the cut reached his sternum, Dorian felt something warm and wet pushing against his chest from within. His breath hitched as realization dawned. They were opening him up. Panic surged again, threatening to consume him entirely, but he fought it down with a desperate kind of determination. He couldn't lose control now. He had to stay awake, stay aware. A sudden sharp pain lanced through his chest, accompanied by the sound of something tearing. Dorian let out a cry despite himself, his body convulsing against its restraints. Warmth spilled over his skin, and he knew without looking that it was his blood. In the dim light, he could see now that there were no visible hands wielding the scalpel, no living mouth to make sense of the wet chewing sound that filled the room. Instead, something moved beneath his flesh, like worms wriggling just beneath the skin of an apple. It was horrifying, invasive, and utterly unlike anything he'd ever witnessed. His breath grew wet and uneven, each inhale ragged with pain. He could feel something inside him shifting, moving, something alive that shouldn't be there. Revulsion threatened to overwhelm him, but he fought it back with every ounce of willpower he possessed. Suddenly, a jaw worked at an impossible angle beneath his ribcage, tearing into him from within. The sound of chewing filled the room, wet and obscene. Dorian screamed, the sound echoing off the cold walls as agony consumed him completely. Darkness threatened to claim him once more, but he fought it back with desperate urgency. He couldn't pass out now. He had to stay awake, had to witness whatever was happening to him. His body trembled uncontrollably, shock setting in as blood loss began to take its toll. As the chewing sound finally stopped, Dorian became aware of another sensation, something cold and wet moving within his chest cavity. He could feel it pressing against his organs, shifting them aside with a careless indifference that made bile rise in his throat. Then, suddenly, he felt it. An ancient intelligence buried deep within him, pulsating like some horrible heartbeat. It was the unseen watcher, the malevolent force behind everything that had happened aboard the Zephyr. And now, finally, it had taken control of Dorian's body completely. The realization sent a wave of terror crashing over him. washing away all thoughts of pain or shock or even survival. He was no longer himself. He belonged to something else now. Something ancient and alien, and horrifyingly intelligent. And then, with a sudden clarity that filled him with dread, Dorian understood why they had brought him here. Why they had subjected him to this terrible ordeal. They wanted him to see what was happening beneath the waves, to bear witness to the truth of their existence. And now that he knew, there could be no escape. His vision began to swim, darkness encroaching from all sides as consciousness slipped through his fingers like sand. But before everything went black, Dorian caught sight of something that sent a final, chilling realization coursing through him. The operating table was not designed for humans at all. As darkness claimed him completely, Dorian knew with bone-chilling certainty that he had been right all along. This was only the beginning of his torment, and there was no escape. Not now, not ever. But even as fear threatened to consume him entirely, another thought surfaced amidst the horror. Perhaps, just perhaps, this was never about escaping it at all. Dorian's eyes fluttered open to a world bathed in an eerie, greenish glow. His head throbbed like a dull drumbeat, each pulse sending waves of pain through his body. He tried to move, but found himself restrained once more, this time suspended upright against a cold, damp wall. Panic surged within him, but he forced it down, focusing on the harsh reality around him. The wet dragging sound echoed louder now, resonating from behind the walls like some ancient beast stirring awake. The emergency lights cast long dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own. Dorian's breath came in short, sharp gasps, each inhale laced with the metallic tang of blood and the underlying rotten egg stench of sulfur. He looked down at his body, bile rising in his throat as he took in the sight. His clothes were gone, replaced by a crude harness that held him upright, leaving him bare, except for the tattered remnants of his underwear. His skin was slick with sweat and blood, matted hair hanging limp around his face like a shroud. But what drew his gaze and sent a wave of nausea crashing over him was the state of his abdomen. The incision from earlier was still open, but now it was raw, inflamed, and weeping pus. Flies buzzed greedily around the wound, landing briefly before being shooed away by Dorian's desperate flinches. The edges of the cut were uneven, ragged, as if torn apart rather than sliced cleanly. And worst of all, they refused to close. Dorian felt a sudden warmth spread across his belly, followed by the unmistakable sensation of something moving beneath his flesh. He let out a scream that echoed through the chamber, the sound drowned out only partially by the wet dragging noise in the walls. His body convulsed against the restraints as terror seized him, but there was nowhere to run, no way to escape. Then, just as suddenly, the sensation stopped. Dorian's breath came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving with effort and panic. He forced himself to focus on anything else. The cold of the wall, pressing against his back, the taste of blood in his mouth, the rhythmic pulsing of pain from his injured abdomen. But it was no use. His mind kept drifting back to that ancient intelligence buried deep within him, waiting patiently like some horrific parasite. He could feel its presence now, a sickening weight in his gut, a twisted whisper at the edge of his consciousness. It was waiting for something, but what? A sudden change in the wet dragging sound made Dorian jerk his head towards it. The noise had shifted, become more insistent, and now sounded almost like footsteps. He strained his eyes against the dim light, trying to make out anything moving in the shadows. Then he saw it, a figure emerging from the darkness, its form bloated and misshapen, barely recognizable as human. It shuffled towards him with an awful lurching gait, each step accompanied by that now familiar wet dragging sound. Dorian's stomach churned as Morgan came into view, her once delicate features now grotesquely distorted. Her eyes bulged from their sockets like marbles, veins of black, pulsating beneath translucent skin. Her mouth hung open in a perpetual grimace, revealing rows of jagged teeth that seemed too large for her jaw. "Morgan," Dorian gasped out, horror and disbelief warring within him. What happened to you? She looked up at him with those terrible bulging eyes, and for a moment, Dorian thought he saw something like sadness flicker across her face. Then she spoke, her voice a wet gurgle that sent shivers down his spine. "You're here now," she said, each word laboriously forced from her distorted mouth. "Finally." Dorian felt a chill run through him, colder even than the damp air of the chamber. He understood then why they had chosen him, why they had subjected him to this torment. They had been waiting for him, cultivating Morgan's body until it was ready to bear witness to his arrival. But why?" he stammered, desperation clawing at his throat. "Why me?" Morgan tilted her head slightly, like a dog trying to understand its master's commands. Then she reached out one bloated hand and touched the ragged edges of Dorian's wound. He flinched away from her touch, but the restraints held him firm. "Because," she said, her voice barely above a whisper now, "you're the right one." The words hung heavy between them, filled with implications too terrible to comprehend. But Dorian didn't have time to dwell on their meaning, for something else caught his attention. The wet dragging sound had stopped entirely. Instead, there was only silence, and then, very softly at first, the faintest whisper of breath. It seemed to come from all around him, filling the chamber with an unsettling rhythm that made his skin crawl. He recognized it instantly. It was the same breathing he'd heard aboard the Zephyr, the one that had haunted his nightmares ever since. Who are you?" Dorian choked out, fear gripping him like a physical vice. The breath grew louder now, echoing around them like some malevolent heartbeat. And then, with a sudden clarity that filled him with dread, Dorian realized something. He was no longer alone in his body. There were two of them breathing within him now, one weak and ragged, the other ancient and powerful. He could feel it. A terrible, pulsating intelligence that threatened to overwhelm him completely. It was the unseen watcher, the malevolent force behind everything that had happened aboard the Zephyr. And now it was here, inside him. A wave of terror crashed over Dorian, drowning out all thoughts of pain or shock or even survival. He was no longer himself. He belonged to something else now, something ancient and alien and horrifyingly intelligent, and there could be no escape. His vision began to swim, darkness encroaching from all sides as consciousness slipped through his fingers like sand. But before everything went black, Dorian caught sight of something that sent Dorian's vision swam, darkness clawing at the edges like tendrils of nightmarish ink. His breath came in ragged gasps, each one echoing with that ancient rhythm, growing louder, more insistent. He felt a terrible pressure building within him, a sensation akin to being stretched too thin, about to snap. His body began to convulse, spine arching against the restraints, muscles clenching and releasing in spasms beyond his control. He could hear something wet tearing, flesh rending, but it was distant, like listening through water. Then he felt it, a hot searing pain, as something inside him pushed outward, forcing its way into the world. Morgan's bloated face swam before him, eyes wide with terror or wonder. Dorian couldn't tell which. She reached out one trembling hand, fingers splayed wide, and touched his cheek gently. Her lips moved, forming words he couldn't hear over the roar in his ears. Then her eyes rolled back, whites gleaming like twin moons, and she collapsed to the floor, lifeless. The breath was everywhere now, filling him completely, drowning out all other sensation. He felt his jaw stretch wide, wider than any human mouth could possibly go, and with a sickening crunch, something began to emerge from between his teeth. It was wet and glistening, writhing like a serpent as it pulled itself free of Dorian's body. His vision cleared briefly, long enough for him to see the thing fully. A vast, pulsating mass of flesh, covered in eyes that blinked open one by one, regarding him with ancient, malevolent intelligence. The realization struck him then. He had been wrong. It wasn't just watching him. It had been inside him all along, waiting patiently for its chance to take over completely. And now it was too late. Dorian's last thought before darkness claimed him was not of fear or pain, but of betrayal. He had come here seeking answers, justice even, and instead he had delivered himself into the very evil he'd sought to expose. As the monolith's walls dissolved around him, revealing an endless swallowing ocean, Dorian understood that there would be no escape for him now. But perhaps, he thought with a final desperate spark of hope, there might still be time for others, for if this was to be his end, then he would make sure it meant something. He would not go quietly into the darkness. He would fight, scream, rail against his fate until there was nothing left. And so, with one last defiant roar that echoed through the chamber like thunder, Dorian Whitlow took his final breath and surrendered himself to the depths. As the vast pulsating mass of flesh floated above Dorian's lifeless body, its countless eyes blinked in unison, taking in the scene. Morgan lay crumpled on the floor, her bloated form already shrinking back towards human proportions as the ancient intelligence within her dissipated now that its purpose was served. The creature seemed to regard Dorian's corpse for a moment longer, before turning its attention to the chamber itself. Its gaze flicked over the restraints, the tables strewn with medical equipment, the walls slick with blood and moisture. Then it drifted upwards, towards the ceiling where a single light bulb hung swaying gently from its frayed cord. As it approached, the light flickered and died, plunging the chamber into darkness once more. But this time, there was no sense of terror or claustrophobia. Instead, an eerie calm settled over the room, as if all the horror had been leached away along with Dorian's life force. The creature hung there in the dark, unmoving, except for the rhythmic pulsing of its flesh. Then slowly, it began to shrink, folding in on itself like some grotesque origami sculpture, until it was no larger than a clenched fist. With a final beat of its pulsating heart, it fell to the floor with a wet thud. Silence filled the chamber once more. Outside, the storm raged on, waves crashing against the cliffs as if trying to claw their way inland. But within these walls, there was only stillness and emptiness. Or so it seemed. For as the first faint light of dawn began to filter through a high, grime-streaked window, something stirred amidst the shadows. A hand twitched, fingers curling slightly before relaxing again. Then another twitch, this time accompanied by a ragged intake of breath. Dorian Whitlow opened his eyes. He lay there for several long moments, staring up at the cracked ceiling, as if trying to make sense of what he saw. His body felt strange, heavy and sluggish, but otherwise unharmed. There was no sign of any injury, no trace even of the wound that had once been gaping and raw. Slowly he sat up, wincing at the stiffness in his muscles. He remembered everything: the ancient intelligence, Morgan's transformation, the creature emerging from his own body. And yet here he was, alive and whole, despite all evidence to the contrary. A sudden noise startled him, a soft dragging sound coming from the corner where Morgan had fallen. Dorian turned towards it, eyes widening in disbelief as he saw her begin to stir, her bloated form shrinking back towards human proportions, just as the creature's had done. But unlike the creature, Morgan did not stop at mere transformation. As she rose unsteadily to her feet, Dorian could see that something else was happening. Her limbs elongated, spine straightened, features smoothed out until they bore no trace of their previous distortion. When she finally stood before him, it was as if she had never been changed at all. She regarded him with wide, frightened eyes, one hand pressed against her mouth, as if holding back a scream. "Dorian?" she whispered, voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. Is that really you?" He could only stare at her, shock rendering him momentarily speechless. Then he found his voice, harsh and disbelieving. "What happened? How are we still alive?" Morgan shook her head, looking around the chamber as if seeing it for the first time. "I don't know," she said softly, "but I think maybe we were never meant to die here." Dorian followed her gaze, taking in the chamber with new eyes. Now that the creature was gone, Now that its malevolent presence no longer hung heavy in the air, it seemed almost mundane. Just another abandoned room filled with old furniture and forgotten memories. Then he noticed something else. A door set into one wall, partially concealed behind a rotting curtain. It had been there all along, but neither of them had seen it until now. Together, they approached the door, hands reaching out simultaneously to grasp the cold metal handle. With a single glance at each other, a silent communion filled with hope and terror and disbelief. They turned the handle together and pulled. The door opened onto a narrow staircase leading upwards towards sunlight, and